Now we're starting the eye. A lot of parts to the eye, many of which you do not need to know. Obviously, the eyelashes prevent particles from staying on the eye. Blinking keeps the eye lubricated and removes dust from the eye. The outer surface of the eye in the front is covered by a membrane called conjunctiva. You may have heard of pink eye, which is conjunctivitis. And the conjunctiva is this epithelium that covers the outer surface of the eye and the inner surface of the eyelids. Also, we find what are called tarsal glands, and these are modified sebaceous glands inside the eyelid, and they're going to produce this oily substance that will keep the eyelids from sticking together. The tears are produced by glands called lacrimal glands, and tears reduce friction. They remove debris that's landed on the eye, and they contain lysozyme, which is an antibacterial enzyme. They also contain antibodies, and the tears provide nutrients and oxygen to the conjunctiva. The lacrimal apparatus is something that you can basically ignore. We'll look at this picture here. Over here on the lateral superior surface of the eye is the lacrimal gland, and those tears are secreted through ducts on the outer surface of the eye, and they travel across the eye inward. They are going to go through tiny little holes here and then enter the lacrimal canaliculi. All this area here you can just kind of ignore. Just know that your lacrimal glands are on the outer surface of the eye. And there's some pink eye. Now, pink eye is quite contagious. A lot of kids get it, pass it on to other kids or their parents, and it can be caused by bacteria, some type of allergy, variety of things. The wall of the eye contains 3 layers: the outer fibrous, the middle vascular, and the inner neural layer. The fibrous outer layer is basically the cornea and the sclera. The whites of our eye is the sclera, and the cornea is a transparent covering over the surface of the eye, the anterior surface. And the eye is really quite rigid itself. There's this fibrous layer makes it really quite sturdy, and it allows for attachment of the eye muscles. Those eye muscles that move our eyes are called extrinsic eye muscles. And the cornea, which is transparent, allows light to pass through, and it bends the light as well. The choroid, so here we're in the middle vascular layer of the eye. The choroid has it's called the choroid coat, and it's got a good blood supply. In this middle wall is also the iris. That's the colored portion of your eye. It is a muscle, and the iris can dilate and constrict, changing the size of the pupil, thereby limiting the amount of light entering the eye. It secretes and absorbs aqueous humor, which is fluid in the anterior portion of the eye. It controls the shape of the lens. So our lens actually changes shape as we focus on different objects, and it changes shape by this muscle called the ciliary body, and the ciliary body holds that lens in place with tiny little suspensory ligaments. The inner neural layer of the eye is the retina, and it contains a thin outer pigmented layer that absorbs light. If we were dissecting an eye, you would see there's this very dark iridescent coat, and that keeps light inside the eye. And then there's a thick inner neural layer that has the photoreceptors, the cells that are sensitive to light, and you probably know the names of those. Those are the rods and cones. So here again we are, the structures: the outer fibrous layer, the white sclera, comes around to the front of the eye to become the transparent cornea. Here is our aqueous humor. It's fluid. The lens is held in place by these tiny little suspensory ligaments attached to the ciliary body, so the ciliary body can change the shape of the lens. Here is the iris, colored part of the eye, and between the iris is just an opening. That opening is the pupil, and that iris can constrict and dilate to regulate the light flowing through that pupil. The ciliary body and the lens divide the eye into two cavities, the anterior cavity and the posterior cavity. We don't need to worry about the subdivision of the anterior cavity, but the large posterior cavity contains a gel-like substance called the vitreous humor. So here's our posterior cavity, the lens with the suspensory ligaments and the ciliary body. Here's the iris, the pupil is the opening, and here is the anterior cavity. There are 6 extrinsic eye muscles, none of which you need to know. And here they are. And each extrinsic muscle, when contracted, produces different eye movements, of course. So you need to know the structures that light passes through as on its way to the retina. It will first pass through the cornea. The cornea is transparent. And then it will pass through the anterior cavity, chamber, and the lens. And then it will pass through the vitreous humor in the posterior chamber, and then it will hit the retina, and the retina has the photoreceptors. The choroid, again, is the middle coat that is vascular, and the sclera is part of the dense fibrous outer coat that provides shape to the eye. So light will pass through the center of the cornea and it will bend. In this chapter, bending is called refraction. So the light refracts by the cornea as well as the lens to land on a very specific location on the retina. Now, when you're trying to see most clearly, if you want your sharpest vision, that light will land on what's called the fovea of an area called the macula. And that fovea is the site of the sharpest vision. So here's light passing through into the eye, passing through the cornea, the anterior chamber, the lens. Of course, it passes through the pupil, but that's not a structure, it's just an opening. Through the lens, through the vitreous humor to land on the macula fovea, part of the retina that has the sharpest vision. There are muscles that dilate and constrict the eye, and again, those are some detail that we don't need to get into. And you can pause if you want to read about those muscles here. So light is refracted or bent when it passes from one medium to another with a different density. For example, when it passes from air into water, or from air to the cornea, and then from the cornea through the fluid. So light rays are refracted by the cornea. The lens provides refraction to focus the light rays toward the focal point on the retina. So here is, hopefully, is the retina, and the image must land on the retina for us to be able to see it. If it lands in front of the retina or behind the retina, then we cannot see that object. It will be blurry. So the lens will change shape or accommodate for close and far vision. And again, a little too much detail on that. So for close vision, the ciliary muscles contracted, the lens is kind of rounded, and the focal point is on the fovea, right on the retina. For distant vision, the lens is flattened in order for that image to land right on the fovea. The eye is a bit like the microscope in that the image that lands on the retina is inverted and reversed. Now our brain compensates for that, so we see the way it is in nature. But they've done some really interesting studies where they put goggles on people who volunteered for this study, and what these goggles did was turn their world upside down. So the ceiling was the floor was the ceiling, and so it was kind of hard to navigate. But within 3 days, their brain adapted to those goggles, and their brain turned everything right side up so they could navigate their world. Then they took the goggles off the people, and their brain was still turning objects upside down. So without the goggles, they saw their world upside down. Again, it took a few days for the brain to accommodate to that, and they could finally see the world correctly around them. So our brain does compensate for things around us. So here's this image of this telephone pole landing upside down and backwards on the retina. All right, to view close objects, there's got to be more refraction. Children can change the shape of their lens. Children can change the shape of their lens, but with age, that lens is less elastic and it stiffens. And so the focal point or near point, that is how close you can see something, changes. So if you were to put a pencil in front of your eye, how close can you bring it where you can still focus on that pencil? That will change, that near point. So it gets farther and further away, and so by the age of 40, you have to see things at basically arm's length in order to be able to focus on them. And this is because the lens refuses to change shape. The retina has got way too much detail for us. And we'll look at that detail briefly, but you do not need to know that detail. So remember, the outer part, the outer coat, is the sclera, and the center coat is the choroid, which is the vascular layer, and then the inner layer is the neural layer. But the neural layer is going to contain this dark pigmented layer on the outside that retains light in the eye. And you can see, oops, let's go back up there. And so you can see the pigmented part of the retina here. It's a dark layer that's going to keep light in the eye. And then next to that will be the photoreceptors. And your photoreceptors are rods and cones. The next layer, the ganglion cells, they form the innermost layer of the neural layer. Now the axons of these ganglion cells are going to combine or converge here at the back of the eye in a region called the optic disc to form the optic nerve. And this area here at the back of the eye has no photoreceptors, so we can't see anything if the object lands on that spot there, and it's called the blind spot. Blood vessels are going to enter and leave the eye in the center of the optic nerve. And then, if you look at the if you look through the pupil at the back of the retina, you can see those blood vessels. And now we know that we can tell a lot of your health by looking at the back of your eye. You can see how an ophthalmologist can see how good your circulation is in that eye to see if you have some issues. So there's that optic disc, the blind spot. There's the macula, and then the center of it's the fovea, and that's where our sharpest vision is.